Something is breaking beneath the surface of America's immigration debate, and most people will not see it until the damage is already done. This is not just a story about deportation. It is a story about power deciding which families matter, which migrants are politically useful, and which human beings can be pushed out of sight without political cost. And if you think this begins and ends with Cuba, you are missing the larger warning. What is happening here is a test case for how far the state can go when fear, politics, and policy fuse into one machine. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work so we can keep bringing you sharp, honest analysis on the political and economic forces shaping our world. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today we break down what's shaping our world. Let's begin with a hard truth. The most revealing part of any government policy is not what officials say about it. It is what that policy does to the weak when nobody powerful is in the room. That is where the mask drops. That is where the slogans die. And in the case of Trump's deportation push against Cubans, the reality is devastating. Rosaly Estévez was living in Miami. She was 32 years old. She was not presented to the public as some major threat. She was not the face of violent crime. She was something far more politically vulnerable in modern America. Removable. When she self-deported from Miami to Havana last November, that phrase carried the cold polish of bureaucracy. But the event itself was not voluntary in any meaningful moral sense. U.S. immigration officers told her detention was likely coming. The pressure narrowed. The choices collapsed. So she left with her 3-year-old son, Dylan, who was a U.S. citizen. As she departed, officers removed her ankle monitor. And that image matters. The state no longer needed to hold her physically. It had already done the deeper work. It had taught her fear, structured her options, and pushed her out. That is how power often operates in advanced political systems. It does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork, timing, legal uncertainty, and the strategic use of exhaustion. It turns law into atmosphere. It fills the air around a person until leaving starts to look like choice. But this is not choice in the language ordinary people understand. This is coerced compliance dressed up as procedure. Now look at Heidy Sánchez. She did not even get Rosaly's thin, painful version of an exit. She was forcibly removed from Florida last April. She was 43. She left behind her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylin, and her American husband, Carlos. That detail alone should stop every decent person in their tracks. A mother deported, a breastfeeding child left behind. A family split not by war, not by natural disaster, not by private violence, but by a state policy defended in the language of order. Heidy described standing there before the flight, her breasts swollen, thinking only one thing: her little girl must be hungry. That is not abstract politics. That is government power entering the body itself. That is the human nervous system absorbing the cost of ideology. And here is where Americans need to stop and think carefully. Neither of these women is central to the national mythology being sold to voters. They are not billionaires. They are not political donors. They are not made useful by elite media framing. They are simply the kind of people who get crushed when power systems are calibrated for political symbolism instead of public wisdom. In that sense, they are not exceptions. They are the point. For years, Cuba has functioned in American politics as a convenient symbol. Candidates talk about freedom, to dictatorship, exile, and moral clarity. The language is familiar. The choreography is polished. Florida politics, donor interests, anti-Havana messaging, and national immigration theater all blend together. But once you strip away the stage lights, what you often find is something much uglier: ordinary Cubans being used from both directions. Washington pressures Havana in the name of liberty, while also tightening the vice on Cubans inside the United States in the name of law. One government failure feeds another government response. The human being in the middle gets squeezed by both. That is why this story matters far beyond one community. What we are witnessing is the collision of immigration enforcement with foreign policy signaling. Trump's approach to Cuba has never been just about Cuba. It is about electoral management in Florida. It is about rewarding hardline political networks. It is about proving toughness to a wider American audience. And once that machinery is set in motion, it needs examples. It needs visible outcomes. It needs people whose lives can be broken quietly enough that the spectacle remains politically useful but morally distant. From an economic standpoint, this is also part of a broader pattern. States under political pressure often shift costs downward. They do not absorb instability at the top, they transfer it to the bottom. When a government wants to appear strong, it rarely begins by inconveniencing powerful actors. It begins with migrants, the legally uncertain, the socially isolated, the people least able to shape the narrative. That is what makes deportation policy so revealing. It shows who can be sacrificed to maintain the image of control. And make no mistake, image is central here. Trump has spoken as if his broader campaign on Cuba is meant to protect Cuban Americans, to honor them, and even to imagine a future where they can reconnect with their homeland. But that rhetoric collapses when you examine what is happening to recent Cuban migrants in real life. This is the contradiction at the center of the story. One class of Cubans is politically flattered. Another class is administratively hunted. One is symbolically embraced. The other is processed, threatened, and expelled. The deeper issue is not only cruelty, it is classification. The state is deciding, in real time, which Cubans count as useful symbols and which count as disposable bodies. And once a government becomes comfortable making that distinction, the damage spreads fast. Families stop trusting institutions. Communities fracture internally. Fear becomes a daily routine. People reduce their movements, avoid exposure, change jobs, skip weekends out, and live in defensive patterns. That is not social stability. That is low-grade internal intimidation. And the phrase, "it's been brutal," is therefore not just emotional testimony, it is a political diagnosis. It tells us that what looks clean from Washington is experienced as chaos on the ground. It tells us that behind every polished phrase about enforcement stands a much messier truth. A mother in Havana watching her American son clutch a phone to feel close to his father in Miami. Another mother separated from her breastfeeding daughter. A family forced to convert love into screen time, paperwork, and waiting. This is where the real story starts. Not in the press release, not in the campaign slogan, not in the false comfort of legal language. It starts here, with families pulled apart by a policy that claims strength while manufacturing trauma. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did Cubans, once treated as politically favored migrants in the United States, become exposed to the full force of a deportation system now being used as both domestic weapon and international message? From fast track to target list. For much of the post-1959 era, Cuban migration to the United States was never treated as just migration. It was treated as political evidence. Every Cuban who arrived on American soil could be folded into a larger Cold War narrative. Communism was failing. The United States was the sanctuary. And exile itself was proof of who was winning the moral argument. That story shaped policy in ways most Americans barely noticed, because for decades it felt normal. Cubans were placed in a special category. They were not simply another group at the border. They were politically useful arrivals entering a system designed to send a message far beyond immigration law. That distinction matters because it explains what is happening now. When people say Cubans were once fast-tracked, they are describing more than an administrative benefit. They are describing a geopolitical privilege. The United States offered many Cubans a smoother road to residency and citizenship, not only because of compassion, but because of strategy. Washington wanted Cuban exile to function as a living indictment of Havana. The policy served foreign policy, domestic politics, and ideological theater all at once. This is the part many people still do not want to admit. Migration law is rarely just about humanity. It is often a weapon, a signal, an investment, or a bargaining chip. And when a population's political value changes, its treatment can change with shocking speed. That is the real meaning of the current moment. Cubans are now learning what happens when a favored category becomes a vulnerable one. Roughly 45,000 Cubans across the United States are believed to have deportation orders. When another 550,000 are thought to be living in legally fragile conditions, and about 850,000 Cubans have arrived in the last 4 years alone. Those numbers do not describe a minor shift. They describe a structural break. They tell us that the old framework has cracked open and that a large group of people once buffered by history is now exposed to the blunt logic of enforcement politics. This is not a paperwork story. It is a reclassification story. In one era, the Cuban migrant was politically framed as a refugee from communism, almost by default. In the current environment, many recent Cuban arrivals are being folded into a very different national script: border anxiety, institutional toughness, demographic pressure, and administrative removal. That change in framing is everything. Once the category moves, everything else follows. Public sympathy weakens. Legal discretion tightens. The language of welcome is replaced by the language of backlog, burden, and control. From the standpoint of political economy, this shift is brutally rational. States do not preserve special treatment forever unless they still see a strategic return on it. During the Cold War, Cuban arrivals helped validate American power. In today's climate, large migrant flows create new fiscal, political, and administrative pressures. That means the incentive structure has changed. A government facing domestic anger over immigration is less likely to maintain symbolic exceptions, especially when those exceptions no longer produce clear political gains across the board. The result is exactly what we are seeing now: a once protected group being pulled into a much harsher enforcement matrix. There is another layer here that deserves attention. The collapse of Cuban exceptionalism is not just changing how the state sees Cubans. It is changing how Cuban Americans see one another. Older legal pathways gave previous generations a sense of order, legitimacy, and moral distinction. Newer arrivals are entering under far more chaotic conditions, and that difference is producing tension, judgment, and distance inside the community itself. When the ladder is pulled up, those who climbed it first often start talking as if they built it themselves. But history does not support that arrogance. The truth is simpler and harsher. The many older advantages were products of timing and geopolitics, not personal virtue. The door was open because Washington wanted it open. Now that the strategic climate has changed, the same system is showing its harder face. That should concern every American, not only Cubans, because a state that grants dignity on the basis of utility can always withdraw it when utility fades. That is the deeper lesson of this moment. What is happening to Cubans today is not an isolated policy adjustment. It is a demonstration of how power reorders human worth when political priorities shift. And once you understand that, the contradiction at the center of Trump's politics becomes impossible to ignore. While one Cuba is still praised, celebrated, and politically courted, another Cuba is being pushed toward the deportation line. Two Cubas in Trump's mind. The most important thing to understand about Donald Trump's Cuba politics is that they are not built on one Cuba. They are built on two. And those two Cubas do not receive the same treatment, the same sympathy, or the same political value. In Trump's political imagination, one Cuba is useful, respectable, and marketable. The other is disposable, risky, and administratively expendable. One is embraced in rhetoric. The other is cornered in practice. That is not confusion. That is the system working exactly as designed. The first Cuba is the one most familiar to Republican power politics in Florida. The older exile narrative, so the anti-Havana establishment, the donor class, the politically connected Cuban-American elite, and the symbolic architecture built around communist repression, patriotic rescue, and American strength. This is the Cuba that fits neatly into campaign strategy. It can be praised at rallies, honored in speeches, elevated through appointments, and folded into the mythology of hardline leadership. It is emotionally resonant, politically organized, and financially connected. It gives Trump what he values most in politics: loyalty, visibility, and a return on investment. Marco Rubio sits close to the center of that world. He is not just a public official, he is a political signal. The son of Cuban immigrants, hawkish on Havana, deeply legible to both Washington and Florida, Rubio represents a kind of Cuban identity that the Trump political machine finds useful. Disciplined, anti-communist, electorally valuable, and fully integrated into American power. That kind of Cuba is not seen as a burden. It is seen as an asset. But then there is the second Cuba. This Cuba looks very different. It is made up of recent arrivals, legally fragile families, workers waiting on hearings, mothers separated from children, men and women living under constant uncertainty, and migrants whose relationship to the United States is not mediated by donor networks or official influence, but by paperwork, surveillance, deadlines, and fear. This Cuba does not walk into the political system through the front door. It enters through the administrative maze, and once inside that maze, it becomes vulnerable to a very different kind of state power. That is the contradiction many Americans still fail to grasp. Trump can speak warmly about Cuban Americans in one breath and oversee a machinery that threatens Cuban migrants in the next because, in his framework, these are not the same political category. And this is where historians like Ada Ferrer have made an important observation. Trump appears to collapse Cuban Americans, exiles, and recent migrants into one rhetorical field while separating them sharply in policy reality. He is inclusive toward the Cubans who strengthen his political coalition and exclusionary toward the Cubans who complicate his immigration narrative. That is why his rhetoric about wanting people to one day return to a better Cuba sounds so unstable. On the surface, it is sentimental. Underneath, it is transactional. It suggests belonging while preserving hierarchy. It flatters one section of the Cuban origin population while keeping another section exposed to removal. That is not a foreign policy doctrine. It is a domestic sorting mechanism disguised as concern. And the financial logic underneath this matters. Florida is not just another state. It is a money state, a message state, and an electoral proving ground. In Cuba, politics there do not operate in isolation. They move through donors, media ecosystems, local power brokers, and long-established networks of influence. Hardline rhetoric toward Havana has political value because it mobilizes a certain class of voter, donor, and activist. At the same time, immigration enforcement has political value because it energizes another part of Trump's coalition nationally. So the contradiction is not a liability. It is a strategy of parallel extraction. He pulls symbolic capital from one Cuba and political capital from cracking down on the other. This is a classic power arrangement. Elites receive recognition. The precarious receive discipline. The upper tier gets access, appointments, and rhetorical embrace. The lower tier gets legal exposure, bureaucratic pressure, and the constant possibility of expulsion. The cruel brilliance of the model is that it lets the same leader appear loyal to a community while punishing large numbers within it. When that is why so many people miss what is happening. They are still listening to the language instead of tracking the structure. From the standpoint of political economy, this is not unusual. Modern populist leadership often works by dividing populations into symbolic insiders and functional outsiders. Symbolic insiders are celebrated because they validate the story the leader wants to tell about the nation. Functional outsiders are controlled because their vulnerability helps prove the leader is tough. Both groups may share ancestry, culture, even family history, but power does not care about cultural coherence. Power cares about utility. That is the real danger here. Once government becomes comfortable with dual classification inside the same community, trust begins to collapse. The law no longer looks neutral, it looks selective. Well, families begin to understand that proximity to power matters more than consistency of principle. People stop asking what the rule is and start asking who the rule is really for. That is a corrosive moment in any republic. And the damage does not stay in Washington or Tallahassee. It enters daily life. It shapes how Cuban migrants move, speak, work, and imagine their future. It sharpens anxiety inside homes and deepens suspicion across the diaspora. It teaches vulnerable people a brutal lesson. In the eyes of power, your identity may be honored at the top and hunted at the bottom. That is Trump's double game on Cuba. One Cuba is courted because it helps him rule. The other is squeezed because it helps him perform rule. And unless Americans are willing to confront that split honestly, they will keep mistaking political theater for strategic leadership, while real families pay the bill in silence. Miami's divide, old exiles, new arrivals, are when the politics of distance. Miami has long sold itself as the moral capital of Cuban exile politics. It is a city built on memory, grievance, ambition, and survival. But beneath that public image lies a harder truth. Exile communities do not remain united forever. They stratify. They police belonging. They decide who gets to speak in the name of suffering, who gets to define legitimacy, and who gets treated as a burden rather than a brother. What we are seeing now inside the Cuban and Cuban-American world is not just a disagreement over immigration. It is a struggle over status, identity, and power under pressure. The divide between older exiles and newer arrivals is often described as generational, but that is too shallow. This is also a divide of class, legal history, political access, and emotional distance from present-day Cuba. Many of the earlier exile families built their place in South Florida through a specific story. They fled communism, they came through pathways that carried political recognition, and they built institutions that translated exile into local power. That story became a source of authority. It shaped media, civic networks, business influence, and political expectations. Over time, it hardened into something more than memory. It became a gate. Then came the newer arrivals. She shaped not by the first revolutionary rupture, but by a very different Cuba. A country battered by economic decay, blackouts, shortages, collapsing services, and mass desperation. They did not arrive carrying the same political script. Many came carrying something much more immediate and much less romantic: survival. That difference matters because it unsettles the old hierarchy. It brings into Miami a Cuban reality that is more chaotic, more economically driven, and less obedient to the traditional exile storyline. This is why some reactions inside the community have been so cold. When people say, "Who are these people?" or "They don't even sound like us," they are doing more than expressing cultural discomfort. They are defending rank. They are drawing a line between the Cubans who are seen as historically legitimate and the Cubans who are treated as socially suspect. And when the answer to a new migrant's fear is, "We came here legally," that phrase is not just a legal argument. It is a claim of moral superiority built on timing, access, and historical luck. That matters because the old pathways available to many earlier arrivals were not simply rewards for personal virtue. They were the product of a geopolitical moment. Washington wanted Cuban exile. It opened doors for strategic reasons. But once a community turns that history into a morality test against newer migrants, it begins to confuse political advantage with ethical merit. That confusion is now tearing at the community from within. You can see the human effect in the life of Ernesto Perez, who crossed the Texas border in 2019, spent time in detention, and now lives in a state of constant legal anxiety. His world has narrowed. He and others like him try to avoid exposure, work from home when possible, and keep their movements limited. This is what fear does when it becomes social routine. It does not always explode. Sometimes it shrinks a life inch by inch until caution becomes identity. Then there is Dario Fernandez, a very different kind of figure. He represents the part of Miami politics that still sees confrontation with Cuba as a source of local legitimacy and political value. By targeting companies that help people on the island through food parcels, travel, phone recharges, or elderly care, he is doing something revealing. He is treating family support across borders not as a human bridge, but as a political threat. He frames that posture in the language of national security, which is how modern politics often launders hardness into virtue. Yet on immigration enforcement itself, he steps back. That silence tells its own story. It shows how some leaders are willing to police transnational care while avoiding ownership of the human wreckage created by deportation politics. When this is the politics of distance in its purest form, the farther someone is from the daily reality of Cuba's current suffering, the easier it becomes to use Cuba as a symbol instead of confronting it as a lived condition. Newer arrivals break that illusion. They know what the shortages feel like. They know what it means to lose power for long stretches, to navigate fear, to watch institutions weaken in real time. Their presence destabilizes simplified narratives. And for that reason alone, they provoke resistance. What makes this especially dangerous is that once a diaspora begins sorting itself through status and suspicion, solidarity becomes harder to recover. A community under pressure can either widen its sense of belonging or retreat into hierarchy. Miami at this moment is showing signs of the second path. And if that continues, the damage will not only be political, It will be moral. Because the deepest fracture in exile is not between left and right. It is between those who remember suffering and those who have started to monetize the memory of it. Deportation as foreign policy by other means. Deportation is usually sold to the American public as a domestic matter, a border matter, a legal matter, a sovereign matter. But in the Cuban case, that description is far too narrow. What is happening is not just immigration enforcement inside the United States. It is part of a wider pressure architecture that reaches across the Florida Straits and feeds directly into the political and economic crisis on the island. In other words, deportation here is not only a tool of internal control, it is also functioning as foreign policy by other means. To understand that, we need to step back and look at systems, not slogans. Cuba is not producing migration in a vacuum. The island is under extreme strain, energy shortages, economic contraction, when weak productive capacity, collapsing public services, and growing humanitarian pressure. U.S. policy is not the only cause of that crisis, but it is clearly part of the operating environment. When Washington tightens pressure on Cuba's economy, while also escalating the political temperature around Cuban migration, it creates a brutal loop. Pressure contributes to instability. Instability drives out people. Those people then become targets inside the American political system. The same crisis is used twice, first to weaken Cuba, then to justify enforcement in the United States. That is not strategy in the higher sense. It is pressure recycling. From the standpoint of political economy, this is one of the oldest mistakes powerful states make. They treat migration only as a border event instead of what it really is, a late-stage signal of deeper structural breakdown. When large numbers of people move, they are telling you something has already failed upstream. Its jobs have failed, infrastructure has failed, institutions have failed, daily life has failed. If policy responds only at the point of arrival, while helping preserve or intensify the conditions that generated the exodus, then the state is not solving a problem. It is managing the optics of a problem. That matters because optics can win an election cycle, but they do not stabilize a region. Look at the Cuban case closely and the logic becomes painfully clear. Cuba loses people through mass immigration, including workers, young adults, skilled professionals, and many of the very people needed to rebuild economic life. That is a direct drag on the island's recovery potential. Families become more dependent on remittances, outside support, and transnational care networks just to survive. But then the United States turns around and threatens part of that displaced population with removal, legal uncertainty, or forced return. That creates a two-sided distortion. Cuba bleeds human capital. The United States absorbs the social stress, then weaponizes that stress politically. No serious strategist should call that a stable design. And the fallout does not stop with Cuba and the United States. This is where the regional dimension becomes critical. When Cubans are deported or pushed into hopeless legal limbo, many do not simply settle back into Cuba and rebuild life. They move again. They look to Brazil, Mexico, Serbia, or other countries where entry is more possible. That means deportation does not necessarily end migration. It redirects it. It turns one route into five. It turns one legal crisis into a hemispheric circulation of uncertainty. Families fragment across multiple jurisdictions. Smuggling incentives rise. Informal survival networks deepen. Governments across the region inherit pressures they did not create. And this is exactly why Caribbean leaders have warned that prolonged crisis in Cuba will not remain confined to Cuba. Migration pressure, economic instability, and social breakdown in one country do not respect neat borders, especially in a basin as interconnected as the Caribbean. If Washington wants to be seen as the strategic anchor of the hemisphere, then it cannot keep acting as if coercion has no external costs. It does. And those costs accumulate quietly until they become a regional burden. There is also a financial logic under the surface that Americans should not ignore. Disorder is expensive. Family separation creates legal complexity, social service strain, court backlog, enforcement costs, and long-term human fallout that does not disappear just because a deportation order is carried out. Meanwhile, instability in Cuba invites external actors to deepen their role. When the United States relies too heavily on punitive leverage without a credible endgame, It opens space for others to step in economically, politically, and strategically. That is already visible in the broader Cuban context. Vacuums do not remain empty. They get filled. So what is the real effect of deportation in this framework? It sends a message to Havana. It reassures hardliners in Florida. It demonstrates toughness to parts of the U.S. electorate. But systems do not respond to messaging alone. Systems respond to incentives and pressure points. And the incentive structure Washington is creating is perverse. It encourages more fear, more irregular movement, more dependence on informal networks, and more long-term distrust of American intent across the region. The forecast, frankly, is not difficult. If current policy continues, expect more onward migration through third countries, not less. Expect more fragmentation inside Cuban-American families. Expect more underground living among vulnerable migrants already in the United States. Expect more political exploitation of their fear. And expect the Caribbean to read Washington less as a stabilizing power and more as a source of managed volatility. That is the strategic failure at the center of this story. A serious state should distinguish between pressure that produces leverage and pressure that multiplies disorder. Right now, too much of American policy toward Cubans is doing the latter. It is not building a durable outcome. It is exporting instability, importing trauma, or when calling the result enforcement. America's choice: punishment, disorder, or a smarter path. At some point, a serious country has to decide what it is trying to protect: the integrity of law or the performance of force. That is the real question now facing the United States. Because when you strip away the speeches, the slogans, and the familiar theater of border politics, what remains is a policy direction that is punishing vulnerable Cubans, intensifying family fracture, feeding instability across the region, and still failing to produce a durable strategic result. That is not strength. That is drift disguised as discipline. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the damage is not always loud. It accumulates quietly. A mother loses the right to raise her child under one roof. A father becomes a face on a phone screen. A migrant in legal limbo learns to shrink his life until caution becomes his only routine. A community begins to split between those with political protection and those without it. And over time, the country carrying out these policies starts to lose something too. Not just credibility abroad, but coherence at home. The United States has every right to enforce immigration law. No sovereign nation can function without borders, procedures, and the authority to regulate entry and removal. But that is only the beginning of the argument, not the end of it. Law by itself is not wisdom. Enforcement by itself is not strategy. A government can enforce badly, selectively, theatrically, and self-destructively. It can obey procedure while violating proportion. It can claim order while manufacturing deeper disorder. That is the risk now. If the current trajectory continues, the next phase is not hard to foresee. More Cubans inside the United States will remain trapped in legal twilight, neither secure nor fully removable, forced to organize their lives around delay, fear, and constant uncertainty. More people sent out of the United States will not simply restart life in Cuba. Many will move again through Brazil, Mexico, Serbia, or wherever the next possible opening appears. More Cuban-American households will be split not just by ideology, but by immigration status, class, and access to political protection. And more candidates will continue to use that pain as campaign fuel. All because unresolved fear remains one of the cheapest political resources in modern America. This is where moral judgment and strategic judgment become the same thing. A state that governs only for display will eventually lose the capacity to govern for results. And the results matter. Instability in Cuba does not stay in Cuba. Migration pressure does not stop because a speech sounds tough. Family separation does not create regional order. It creates trauma, backlog, distrust, an underground movement, and the slow corrosion of institutional legitimacy. When law is experienced as selective power rather than fair process, people do not grow more loyal to the system. They grow more afraid of it, more cynical about it, and less likely to believe it belongs equally to all. There is also a hard economic truth here that Washington ignores at its own peril. Disorder is expensive. Permanent emergency politics is expensive. Chaotic migration flows, enforcement surges, a detention costs, court delays, fractured labor participation, and long-term family destabilization all come with financial and social costs that compound over time. Stability, by contrast, is cheaper. Clear adjudication is cheaper. A regional strategy that reduces desperation before it turns into displacement is cheaper. Smart policy is not soft policy. In many cases, it is simply less wasteful and more effective. So what would a smarter path actually require? First, honesty. Washington would have to admit that Cuban migration cannot be understood apart from the broader pressure environment surrounding Cuba itself. Second, discipline. It would need to distinguish clearly between genuine public safety threats and ordinary families trapped in administrative exposure. A state that cannot tell that difference is not being strong. It is being blunt. Third, consistency. It would have to stop speaking about Cubans as symbols of freedom while treating many living Cubans as politically convenient liabilities. A republic cannot speak in two moral languages forever without weakening itself. Most of all, it would require a change in governing philosophy. The United States would have to stop confusing performative toughness with strategic competence. Those are not the same thing. Real competence measures downstream consequences. It asks what a policy produces after the cameras move on. It asks whether fear is being reduced or merely redistributed. It asks whether families are being stabilized or shattered. It asks whether America is acting like a mature power with a long horizon or like a nervous power addicted to immediate optics. That is why the story is bigger than Cuba, bigger than Miami, bigger even than immigration. It is about whether the American state still knows how to connect power to purpose. Sure, can it enforce without dehumanizing? Can it lead without constantly escalating? Can it recognize that a policy can be technically lawful and still strategically foolish? Those are not abstract questions anymore. They are sitting in the lives of Rosaly Estévez, Heidy Sánchez, Dylan, Kaylin, Carlos, Ernesto Perez, and countless others whose names will never make it into speeches, but whose lives reveal the true meaning of policy. In the end, when the choice before America is not between control and chaos, that is the false binary of weak politics. The real choice is between shallow punishment and serious statecraft, between short-term spectacle and long-term stability, between a politics that feeds on human vulnerability and a government mature enough to understand that order built on fear is always more fragile than it looks. America still has time to choose the smarter path, but it will have to choose it consciously. Because cruelty has momentum once it becomes politically profitable, and if this country keeps rewarding that momentum, then the next crisis will not just expose a broken immigration system, it will expose a republic forgetting the difference between power used wisely and power used carelessly. This story, at its core, is not only about immigration, it is about what happens when politics turns human lives into instruments. Rosaly Estévez, Heidy Sánchez, Dylan, Kaylin, Carlos, Ernesto Perez, and so many others are not just names in a policy debate. They are living proof that when governments chase power without moral balance, the first victims are almost always ordinary families. One mother is pushed out until self-deportation becomes the only path left. Another is torn away from her breastfeeding daughter. A father is reduced to a face on a phone screen. A man in legal limbo learns to shrink his life, his movements, even his hopes, because fear has become the new routine. And surrounding all of this is a larger machine. Trump's deportation push, the political divide in Miami, the split between old exiles and new arrivals, and the hard truth that some Cubans are embraced as useful symbols while others are treated as disposable. That is what makes this story so powerful. It shows us that behind every headline about law, borders, and national interest, there are human beings carrying the real cost in silence. The deeper lesson is this: never judge a policy only by the words used to sell it. Judge it by what it does to the weak, the voiceless, and the families with the least protection. In our own lives, that lesson matters just as much. We should be careful about any system, workplace, institution, or political movement that talks about strength while casually breaking people. Real strength protects. Real leadership builds stability. Real wisdom never loses sight of human dignity. And for all of us watching, listening, and living in uncertain times, the practical lesson is clear. Pay attention, think critically, do not be manipulated by slogans, and always ask who is paying the hidden price for the decisions being made at the top. Here's a quick question for you. Do you believe current deportation policy is mainly A, about enforcing law, B, about using fear as a political tool? Comment A or B below. Oh, and I also want to hear your view. What do you think this story says about America today? And where do you think the country is heading from here? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can read, compare, and learn from each other. And if you want more sharp, honest analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and support it so we can keep making stronger, deeper content ahead.